everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of Yoga at Trailblazers. I'm here with Amara Miller from Amara Miller Yoga. She has a wonderful blog called All Things Yoga that I follow religiously. She is a avid yogi, artist, sociologist, teacher, perpetual student, much like myself, gardener, dog lover, and much more. So on her blog, she explores a myriad of concepts around yoga and social justice, yoga and race, yoga and body image. You are the real deal and super legit. I love reading your stuff, and you inspire a lot of my writing. So I want to thank you for being on the forefront of having this conversation, for being fearless around having this conversation, and for being an ally for all of us. You really show the world that this is a conversation that includes all of us. Because sometimes when we have body image conversations, the majority of the people having the body image conversation may be in a bigger body. When we have conversations around race, the people who are speaking up loudest about the problems with racial discrimination and institutionalized racism are people of color. And sometimes when we speak up about those issues, we're perceived as complainers, or our experiences are minimized by mainstream culture, or we're imagining what we think is happening to us. When people like you, who are sociologists and members of society who are conscious and enlightened, speak up about this from dominant culture, the dominant culture seems to listen and tap in. So it's really important to have people like you, who I call allies, talking about this conversation alongside with us. It's a very big part of what I believe in is together we rise. That, race and body image is not a single issue to a specific group of people. It's a human issue for all of us. And I think you're very poignant and brilliant in the way that you bring this conversation to your blogs. And as a sociologist, and I know you teach at the University of California at Davis, I know that you're bringing this conversation to students who may not have heard this conversation before at home. So I think as an educator, that makes you a very powerful force in social consciousness and shifting of the paradigm that we're trying to do in yoga and in the world at large. And having said that, thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here and getting a chance to talk with you again. This is so great.
It is so great. So my first question for you is, how did you get involved in yoga?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, people come to yoga for a lot of different reasons. And I think there was actually just a study that was published that I think verifies a lot of our experiences as yogis. A lot of people come to yoga, I think, starting off for stress reasons or for exercise reasons. And that's actually how I actually came to yoga in the first place. So when I was a teen, actually, my mom took me to some yoga classes where we were living as kind of a mother-daughter bonding experience. Totally great mother-daughter bonding experience. Also really just a great experience in general. And so I started doing yoga then, and I continued doing yoga off and on throughout college, my undergrad education, and then when I got into grad school later on, I originally started studying, I was interested in issues of violence and war and mass media coverage of war, so particularly news media coverage and censorship around human rights abuses and warfare. And then I started researching all this stuff, and I realized it was really, really depressing.
Yeah. Oh, really? That's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's really heavy, and it was one of those things where I started to realize that I didn't know if I could emotionally and psychologically research that on a regular basis as much as I think it's really interesting and important. And so I started doing a historical project on yoga, actually, which was of personal interest to me, and then it kind of expanded into my research. So right now I'm doing my dissertation. I'm still a grad student, so I have my MA. I'm still working on my PhD, and then I'm writing my dissertation right now on yoga. So I'm looking at kind of the popularization of yoga in the West, so how yoga kind of worked its way, diffused into the West in particularly the mid-century. So a lot of research prior to this time has focused on really early on in that diffusion process, probably around 1900. And so I'm looking at the later processes. So from around 1950 until now, primarily after the 1960s and the countercultural movements. And then I'm looking at kind of the way that yoga changed when it came here, and also, of course, issues of race and inequality and access in yoga throughout that historical period and then into now, so into the present day.
Wow, that is a a broad topic, an amazing topic, because I don't think anybody's really tapped into a real conversation around that, right? We
No.
hear a lot about Vivekananda, we hear a lot about how it kind of migrated to the West, but we don't hear a lot about how it evolved into what we see today, how it's
Yeah.
kind of become commodified, well, not kind of, how it's become commodified, how the whole idea of yoga is changing and evolving to fit what dominant culture needs in North America and what that means for all of us as a whole. So that is I can't wait for that dissertation. I
It's gonna be
read
fun.
it is going to be amazing. I think it's going to be mind-blowing, and I like reading that kind of that research because there's so much of it you don't even understand or know, and so many influences that you're not even aware of.
Yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about, just because we've had these conversations and I've seen them on your blog, talk to me a little bit about is it so difficult for most people in North America? I'm just gonna, because I'm from Canada, I'm gonna group us together. Difficult to have conversations around race and to bring those conversations up with our children, because I just read an article not too long ago. Is the current culture or the current generation as racist
Yeah, I
as
saw
the
that.
previous generation? And we would love to believe we've evolved, and we're not, but I think part of the problem is we're not really talking about race, or maybe we're throwing our hands up because we don't know what to do, or we don't know how to have the conversation with our children, our peers, or our friends, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think, I think one of the biggest issues I run into when I teach this stuff, because I do teach this stuff, I teach race in almost all my intro classes. And then, someday hopefully I'll get to teach an actual race and ethnicity class. But I like to work it in things that are even unrelated, seemingly unrelated, like Introduction to Social. One of the biggest issues I run into when I teach race and ethnicity in my classes is that I think, especially in North America today, we have this idea that racism, first off, is in the past in our history. And then secondly, that racism is only these very explicit and obvious and negative acts between individuals. So we often have this, false belief that you have to explicitly make it obviously about race for it to be racism, and that it has to be some individual who is just obviously racist, that is doing something racist to someone else for it to be racism. And one of the things we teach in Soch is that racism is actually systemic, that racism can occur on an individual level and does occur on an individual level, I think, as Donald Trump has recently shown us in the media.
Gosh.
but,
Unbelievable.
I know, right? Yeah, his comments were just
unbelievable.
A lot of the racism that goes on in our country, at least in America, and I think, other countries in Europe and the West as well, is that it's been historically so prominent that it's been worked into our laws and into our cultural systems to such a degree that we experience racism every day without even knowing that we're experiencing it, because it's not explicit. It's often very implicit and covert, not overt. So it's often very hidden and very how do I want to, insidious. It's hard to pinpoint. So something as simple as the types of jokes we laugh at, or something as simple as the type of images we see, right, which is a big issue for Yoga and Body Image Coalition, and of course for yoga, can really influence us without our even being aware of it. And that's something that's really hard for students to grasp, I think, and really, anyone to grasp when they're starting to think about racism and really, really think about it. It takes a lot of effort to acknowledge that we live in this system of oppression and also advantage. And I think especially for whites, it can be really hard, because when you acknowledge racism as a systemic issue, as something that systemically oppresses people, you have to acknowledge the reverse, that it also systemically privileges people. And as someone, I'll speak for myself since I am part of this privileged group, I'm white. It can be really difficult to acknowledge that when you first realize, wow, so many of the things I thought I did in my life, I didn't really do, or I did, but I did with a lot of help, a lot of privilege that enabled me to do some of these things that, I feel very proud of. But they're maybe not all me. There are a lot of it has to do with the body I'm in, the body that I'm representing to the world.
Absolutely. So do you think, as a person who is white or the dominant culture, do you think the culture thinks of all of as itself as a white person within the culture? For me, as a person of color, I'm always thinking to myself, separate from that. I'm always a black person within the culture. I'm always looking through the lens of how I'm treated or how this affects me, or as a person of color, how does this work for me? Do you think the white race or dominant culture thinks about themselves as white people, or just as people?
Not
Right.
at all. I actually do this really interesting activity in my classes when I start teaching race. I always start by asking people, before I even introduce what we're talking about that day, I ask them what their top 5 identities are, like the things they identify with most. And it's really interesting because in my classes, almost every single person who is non-white, whatever their race or ethnicity is, will identify that ethnicity or race as an important identity to them. Almost every single person who is white in class, like, it won't even pop up into their top 5. It's always like, I'm a student, or
Right.
these kind
I'm
of
a
general
parent.
things.
Right.
But no, I think white people don't think about race really at all. And I think, what you were saying, where you have this constant awareness as a person of color in our world, I read this article about a mom who goes to the grocery store, and even something as simple as how the checkout person treats you.
Yes.
If they treat you bad, you're like, well, was that because of my race or just because they were having a bad day? You never really know.
Yeah.
It's a constant thing. But when you're white, if someone treats you good, you're not thinking, oh, I wonder if that was because I was white.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with how people treat you better, and so it's really counterintuitive, I think, to think of that positive response might actually have something to do with your race, even though that's very much the case a lot of times. So again, it's this issue of oppression is often much more easy to recognize and much more prominently, much more important. It's a horrible experience. It's incredibly damaging and hurtful. And so it's obvious to people who experience that. But privilege is a much harder thing to pinpoint because it's, psychologically speaking, I think it's something that we often don't attribute to race, again, because we don't think about it that often. And because white people usually don't experience oppression because of the race, they experience privilege. It makes it much harder for them to get this sense that some of the experiences they're having are actually driven by race, and not something else like just having a great day.
Right.
Being friendly to your neighbor.
I find that a lot of people that I encounter outside of the yoga sphere, or outside of the yoga sphere in connection to social justice, have no awareness of what privilege is. And talking on a broader scale, as a person who identifies with having privilege, can you explain the difference between privilege and hardship? Because everybody's got a hardship, right? And the minute I tell somebody, right, the minute I tell somebody, I don't say check your privilege because that's becoming a bad word. That's becoming the new FU or whatever.
Yeah.
But I ask people to, examine what their feelings are around this, or how can you teach people the difference between white privilege or privilege and hardship?
Yeah, and I think, it's important to recognize that everyone has hardships, regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of how much privilege you have, everyone is going to have hardships in their life. Even as a white person, I've had some really crazy shit happen to me. It happens,
Right.
Everyone experiences hardship. The difference between hardship and privilege, I think, is best understood in how we are able to deal with the hardships we experience. So I think a person who has privilege usually has a lot more support to deal with those hardships. So when let's say you go bankrupt or whatever, if you're someone who is white, you will get a lot more institutional and personal support through that process than if you are not. And that's really the difference between privilege and oppression. It's that when we are faced with hardships, the people who have privilege usually have the ability to deal with those and rise above those challenges much more, not because they're just great people, though that can happen too. But a lot of it is often the support you get in part because you have a lot of privilege, again, versus, again, these people who don't experience that privilege often actually have more hardships, the same hardship that they're experiencing, whether it's bankruptcy or whatever. That hardship can be much more affecting of their regular life, of their psychological well-being and mental health and well-being, because they don't have that support network
in place.
So I think looking at a specific example is helpful because it really allows you to get a sense of how that experience would be different. And I think, we always say flip it in sociology, right? Whether that's gender or race or whatever. Flip it, right? Let's say if it's a white person going through bankruptcy, let's flip it and see if it's a black person, what the experience would be different, how it would be different. And usually it's going to be different. It's going to be significantly different on average. Of course, there's always exceptions, always outliers, but on average, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the difference between hardship and privilege.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. As yoga is evolving, I noticed that a lot of organizations are coming up and working towards creating a balance, towards creating equity and equality across all genders and races for yoga. And I was wondering what your take was on the newest like connection between yoga and social justice when we see organizations. The one that comes to mind most readily would be Off the Mat and Into the World. A little bit of work that the work that the Yoga and Body Image Coalition is doing around that part of oppression, being oppressed by our bodies. How do you see yoga and social justice working together?
I mean, this is such a great question. I think yoga and the yoga community has such a really awesome opportunity to engage in social justice work because of the nature of yoga. Yoga is one of those things where if we're really practicing yoga, not just asana, but yoga, what we're talking about is mindfulness. And that mindfulness is about your own life and your own, stuff, obviously. But it's also about being mindful about the world you're in. And so I think yoga in particular has this really it's a powerful mechanism for social justice work, because if we're truly practicing yoga, we have to acknowledge things like inequity and things like inequality and things like oppression and things like privilege, because that's being mindful. And if we aren't acknowledging that, we're not really practicing yoga to the full extent that we can. I mean, everyone can practice yoga, even if you're just doing asana. But I think to deeply get into the practice, that's really what's required. So for yoga and social justice, there's this really unique opportunity where a lot of yogis who are really into yoga and really practice it deeply, especially in these groups we talked about, Off the Mat Into the World and yoga, the Yoga and Body Image Coalition, a lot of these people are very much academics or people who are interested in learning and being more mindful in their own lives, even if they aren't in academia. So I know a Yoga and Body Image Coalition, for example, they do have a lot of academics involved. Off the Mat Into the World, not so much. They have teachers, but a lot of the people who participate are just regular folks who are interested in learning about these things. Again, I think driven by a yoga practice that encourages them to be mindful, encourages them to grow and learn and develop themselves and their awareness. So Off the Mat Into the World is really interesting. I think they're particularly interesting because I've actually seen their evolution from when they first started a few years ago in terms of just starting to get into this kind of social justice work very actively. And Sean Korn has done, I think, a really lovely job of being a really great ally. And I think, Off the Mat Into the World, I think, has really been very promising. When they first started, I was like, I don't know.
Right.
Because they were doing a lot of things without actually engaging with, the communities that were most affected. I think in terms of engaging them as teachers, engaging them as people who would share their stories in a very prominent platform way. But Sean Korn's done a really awesome job, I think, listening to criticisms, acknowledging those criticisms, educating herself about her own privilege, and then actively working to create a coalition of allies, including people who are people of color, people who don't fit that stereotypical, yoga body, who come in and teach and educate people who do,
Right.
which I think is great. So she's done a really cool job, and I think I've grown to really like her organization a lot. I think there's still room to grow, obviously. There's always room to grow.
Absolutely.
It's yoga.
Yeah, growth continues. Yeah. Yeah.
But her organization is such a great model, though, and I think that's Yoga and Image and Body Coalition, again, a very great model in that it's forming a coalition, it's building allyship, it's focusing on this issue of inequality in a way that tries to model a way that is more equal and more equitable, which I think is really what we want to do as yogis if we're going to combine yoga and social justice. With that said, some of the yoga industry has really been keying into the popularity of these approaches, because Yoga Off the Mat and Into the World and Yoga and Body Image Coalition have gotten a lot of press, and a lot of interest in the last couple of years. And I think what we're starting to see happening is the industry is listening, but they're listening in ways that are not necessarily effective.
Yes.
Or really understanding the problem. So I'm actually, the paper I'm working on about the co-optation of the body positive movement
Yes.
is all about this. How, these organizations like Yoga and Body Image Coalition and like Off the Mat Into the World that are doing a really good job of really addressing these issues and building on kind of the momentum in the yoga community to address social justice issues. They've been taken up by yoga industry officials, people like Lululemon or Yoga Journal and Catherine Budig, who don't fully understand what they're doing yet, and they're engaging with body positivity in this way that is really problematic. So it depends on the group we're talking about. I think if we're talking about the group in yoga that is very focused on social justice issues, that is really interested and has been working on them for years, the people involved in the Yoga Body Image Coalition and Off the Mat Into the World, they've been doing this work for much longer, longer than I've even been looking at it, I'm sure. and so these newer entries into this work, this newer industry kind of acknowledgement it's been really interesting to watch, and it's been problematic. So that's kind of one of the things I'm writing about right now. And I think there's a lot of room to grow, and there's a lot of positive stuff that's comes out of it. But there's also this issue that we can't get bogged down. We can't just say, oh, it's all fine now that we have these things. You know, it's not totally fine yet. We're working, and I think we have to keep working on that to make sure that we really get to a place where we have an equitable and just, you know, world, not just within yoga, but outside of it as well.
Absolutely. I know that the yoga industry is just that. It's an industry, and it's based on capitalism. And whenever there's an opportunity to make a dollar, or to set up a way to have people feel that they can buy whatever it is they need to make themselves feel better, we then see them encroach upon that. There's this area where people are vulnerable. Let's take advantage of that. Let's exploit it. Let's make a dollar, and let's move on to the next thing. So I always worry, even when we did our last year, our yoga journal panel of leadership, when we did that and we sat there and we talked about it, some of the leaders in the yoga industry who were on site doing workshops and trainings at the conference were invited to come and sit on the panel and chose not to, which was really, really interesting to me, because they're the first person to talk about positive body image, and they're also the same people to sell me a diet on how to be skinny. So I don't, I don't really understand, and then somehow tell me that this is revolutionary. So, and those people were invited to the table, and they don't. So at the end of the day, I often wonder what the real motivation is. Is it a new way to brand yourself under the title of body positive, and just do whatever it is, and just be purchased by a company and put on an image, and that's how I become even more popular? That's how I get 1 million followers on Instagram. That's how I push myself further out into the stratosphere. Or do I take that privilege that people actually listen to me, that I have 1 million followers, and actually give other people who are doing the work a platform to share that work? So does it become about sharing the process in yoga, or does it become about, again, me, and the ego? Look at me, look at what I'm doing. And I find we have a hard time splitting that. We are at the heart of who we are caught up in our ego, right? And sometimes a self-serving bias is valuable. But at what point does it just catapult into the stratosphere and become about me and how I can market myself in a new and interesting way? And that's kind of what you were talking about. I'm finding that that's kind of the problematic message we're getting. You know, we put up an unflattering picture of Catherine Budek on a magazine, and then we say, oh, this is body positive. I have a problem with that. It doesn't ring true to me. And on the flip side of that, I've been reading some work by, I'm going to say his name wrong, and I apologize right off the bat, Teju Cole, about the white savior industrial complex, where we see pictures, and this was initially my problem with Off the Mat. I would see pictures of all these white, thin, beautiful yoga teachers in places like Cambodia hugging children, or places like Africa hugging children, like we're uplifting these poor, impoverished people in another country. Look at me, without actually going into the country and asking the people what it is that they need from us, and how we can help them, how we can give them a platform to do that. And that was initially my hesitation with Off the Mat. But you were, I was really happy to see them evolve. And as you know, leaning into that organization where I am now, I'm grateful that people actually listen, and I'm hoping that that's part of the yoga, that that people are actually listening.
It would be if they were really practicing.
You know,
totally. And I love that you're talking about this issue of acknowledgement, because I really do feel like a lot of times, the criticisms about this co-optation of body positivity by the yoga industry, a lot of people come back being like, oh, it's a positive message. Like, how could it be bad? If we're spreading more body positivity, like, how is this a bad thing? And I think, what I've been researching is, I teach cultural appropriation issue, this concept. And one of the things I teach about when I teach this concept is that when you're appropriating something, you can have the best of intentions and it can still go badly. And I think a lot of times people, especially people with privilege who are, worried about appropriating, feel like if they have good intentions, that whatever whatever they do, they can do no wrong.
Yeah.
That intentions are all that matter. Like, if I have good intentions and I want to help you, then like no matter what I do for you, it's out of good intention, so it has to be good. And I think we see this a lot with the yoga industry, where it's not so much that they're trying to make a buck off it, though I think they are, but like their primary motive is often because they want to feel better about their bodies and they want to love your bodies. And so this message of body positivity really resonates with everyone, because everyone undergoes it. You know, even privileged people have issues of body image and, you know, want to feel better about themselves. And I think what happens is that out of these good intentions, they take what they find interesting and helpful, and often they take that from a place of privilege, and they ignore some of the more damaging and, you know, underlying causes of these issues that don't really affect them, because they're coming from a place of privilege. So rather than trying to understand how different people coming from different places are affected differently by these issues and addressing, you know, solving all of those issues, they're focusing on solving them for themselves. Again, it's very kind of ego-driven, like, oh, I want to feel better about my body, I'm going to just say, love your body.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're going to ignore a lot of the kind of structural and systemic, again, causes of these issues. So they, instead of saying, oh, it's actually caused by this really, you know, unrealistic coverage of bodies in the media that make us feel bad about our bodies, where there's a systemic cause about why we feel bad about our bodies. Instead of saying that, they're like, oh, it's on me to feel better about my body. I'm going to individualize it and be like, if I need to feel better about my body, it's got to be you feeling better about your body. You don't have to change anything out there. You just have to love your body. And it completely ignores the underlying causes. And so it's this really weird kind of individualistic kind of approach to, I think, body positivity that usually ignores the historical roots of the movement, which obviously come out of feminism. So, the body positivity movement is very much coming out of the feminist movement of the 1970s. It goes all the way back to that time with the Fat Femme movement, and also out of the Black Power movement, particularly the Black is Beautiful movement, right? So these two movements, the feminist movement and the Black is Beautiful movement, came together to create this body image, movement that formed into eventually the Body Image Coalition, of course.
Absolutely.
But when those messages get taken from this movement and put into mainstream industry, we see the complete erasure of the political nature of the movement, this complete, disregard for the systemic causes that this movement is orientated around, and just this focus on this individual, love your body message. That is problematic, because if you're not, addressing the underlying cause, how can you love your body in a world that tells you to hate it all the time? If we're really going to love our bodies and really change things so we can love our bodies, we have to change the world to be like, hey, all your bodies are good. Not like, oh, your bodies are crap.
This body's valuable, this body is not, right? Exactly.
And that involves systemic change.
Absolutely.
Cultural change,
I remember reading The Beauty Myth in university by Naomi Wolf, and one of the quotes out of that book that really resonated with me, that I use if I'm doing any kind of presentation about yoga and body image, I use this quote. And the quote, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, is society's obsession with women's beauty is less about, their obsession is less about thinness and more about control. I'm paraphrasing.
I love that quote.
I love that. You know what I mean?
I don't remember it exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I always have to read it every time. But the message is there, and it's true. It's more of an obsession about obedience, about women being obedient. And I've been reading a lot of stuff by Bell Hooks lately around this whole idea of where women fall, in the whole range within society, what our expectations are, what we're supposed to look like. And I think it's really difficult, like you said, to have a body positive message and to have the people who are giving you the body positive message to still fit the idealized image of what a woman should look like. So it's fine for certain yoga teachers to say, love your body, when they're a massive size 4 or a massive size 6 or a massive size 2. It doesn't necessarily ring true with me, because we're still, as women, going to try to aspire to be that size. And I'm writing a little bit about this in the next blog, where when I was growing up, I'm in my 40s, I'm 45. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as a size 0. And there was no such, and certainly not a double zero. You know what I mean? The smallest size that you could ever get into was a size 2. And boy, did I work really hard to get there. I mean, I survived on apples and crackers and water. And that way, when I was a size 2, somehow my body was worth more, but my brain had vacated the premises because I wasn't eating enough to have an intelligent thought. So it's really interesting. And people will look at pictures of me from that time and assume that I'm really healthy when I'm starving. And in my research around body image, not every diet ends in a disordered eating, episode, but every disordered eating affliction has been created by a diet. So we need to revamp the diet industry. We need to revamp the weight loss industry. We need to look at the health at every size paradigm if we're really going to love our bodies. Right? We totally have to change that. In your conversation, you brought up a really great point about cultural appropriation. Can you explain to me the difference? I have a hard time explaining this to people. The difference between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange or appreciation. Because people are really afraid. Like, you know what I mean? People are running around with the bindi, and they're like, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not really sure about you and the bindi. But you know what I'm saying? Could you?
Totally. And it's interesting because, this is a really fascinating topic for students. I get this question a lot from students, actually. And this is why I've actually worked it into some of my classes, because I got so many questions from students asking to teach about it. I was like, okay, well, I better teach about it. The biggest difference that I usually draw attention to in my classes is power. So I think this is the easiest way to see the difference, at least to immediately be like, oh, that's cultural appropriation or that's cultural exchange. Cultural exchange is going to happen on an equal power footing. And even if you're coming to cultural exchange in an unequal footing, if you're doing cultural exchange properly, you're going to try to equalize that power when you're engaging in cultural exchange. So even if you're coming from an unequal place, when you're doing cultural exchange, you want to equalize the exchange. So I like to talk about this as acknowledgement and education. So an equal amount of talking on both sides. That's a really key part. So it's not just like one person who's appropriating, I'm talking the whole time about everything and I'm assuming I know everything already. It's where you have to come together on an equal footing and be like, hey, this is what I think I know. And you're like, oh, I think I know this. And we're going to talk together. So again, there's this equal power element in cultural exchange that even if you don't have it initially, you're working towards it in a very active way on both sides, where you're both trying to acknowledge each other's experiences, each other's emotions, and work through that very equitably, using each other as support networks, I think, and as allies. And I love the example, there's a wonderful example that's talked about, I think, on Feminist Frequency when they talk about this issue, where they give the example of a white man who's marrying an African woman, and at the wedding ceremony, he wears traditional African garb. But it's not appropriation because he asked about it first. He was invited to wear that. He understood what it meant. And then, there's this equal exchange going on in that situation where it's not like he's just, I'm going to wear it because I think it's cool. You know? He's wearing it for a reason. He understands the significance. And of course, this is a very equitable exchange going on. Versus, right, costumes. I think costumes are a great example of appropriation, right? I'm going to dress up as the Day for the Dead person and go drinking or whatever, right? That sort of stuff is happening on an unequal power balance. And I think that's the way you tell it's cultural appropriation. Where cultural appropriation, unlike cultural exchange where there's equal, cultural appropriation happens on an unequal power balance level, where the person who has more power, both historically and in that moment, usually takes from the person with less power and uses that appropriated good for their own ego, for their own reason, as a form of distinction. And so when we're talking appropriation, I mean, we can see this really clearly with body positivity. What we're seeing with the yoga industry is that they have a lot more power. They're taking stuff from people who have a lot less power historically, and they're using it in ways that only really benefit them, that only really serve to self-distinguish them, rather than to raise up this person to the same level. And I think that's really, the way I like to think about it. I think it's the easiest way to think about it, is this issue of power, and who has the power, is the power balance. Is there an imbalance of power going on? And if there is, it's usually a sign there's appropriation going on in some form.
Thank you. That really clarifies it. It's always nice to have an example so that people can actually put it together in their head, because we can get really academic about this, but if people can't apply it to real life, then it just Goes right over their head. So, as we move forward and as yoga evolves in this century, how do you see social justice playing a role in pulling people who we typically don't see on the yoga mat into the studios? So, right now, yoga is pretty much an affluent activity, right? And when you look at affluence in North America, it's generally connected to people who are white and the dominant culture, and poverty is generally connected to the people who are not white. So we've created this really exclusive club that the majority of people who belong to it often make more than $70,000 a year. Most of the subscribers to Yoga Journal make upwards of $70,000 to $100,000 a year who are buying this magazine. So where does that leave the rest of us?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I really hope to see, and I really think we're starting to see, is the democratization of yoga imagery. Particularly with social media, we're seeing, I think, the way that people who don't fit that stereotype can form communities via the internet in a really powerful way through, things like Instagram that allow people who don't fit that stereotype to still put their images out there in a way that is really beautiful and inspiring and powerful and shared and very, again, equitable, right? This equitable power, at least more equitable than what we're talking about when we're talking about like the Yoga Journal. So there's this prominence where we're seeing, at least in yoga, the ability of people to engage in community building outside of the kind of industry sources.
Yes.
Where in the past, I think yoga, especially in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, became very institutionalized, where if you wanted to learn, you had to go to these very set, places to learn, to be qualified in a way that would, legitimate you at least. You could go learn anywhere else, but to get like that certification.
Yeah.
Proof that you were ready. You had to go to these, these teacher trainings that were almost entirely controlled by very big industries or people that bought into those industries. So I think a lot of teachers, especially early on, were people that taught in this kind of this way that isn't really engaging with social justice. Obviously, very much engaged with yoga, but not thinking about it in terms of how it connects with social justice, which is how we make it more equitable or more inclusive. And I think what we're starting to see now is a group of yogis who are focused on inclusivity, on making yoga inclusive and approaching teaching yoga from that point of view, rather than approaching it from the opposite direction. I'm going to teach yoga and maybe I'll make it more inclusive. They're like, I want to make yoga more inclusive. How do I teach to do that? And we're starting to see that they have the tools to do that. Social media and all these things have allowed these people to form groups. And again, you just taught the teacher training that you taught with Amber.
Yes.
Yeah, that looked so awesome. But a whole teacher training about like how to make yoga more accessible for people. That again, I'm sure you got people from all over America and Canada and the world
and the UK. Yes, it was.
And all of those people are going back to their local communities and bringing those teachings back to their local communities in ways that allows them to engage with students that they wouldn't otherwise engage with, and especially with private yoga teaching too. I think that's definitely been on the rise, where more people are teaching outside of studio spaces.
Yes.
Which I think can be very intimidating for a lot of people. Studio spaces can be very intimidating for people who don't fit that stereotype initially, especially curvy yogis or yogis of color or queer yogis can feel very uncomfortable in studio spaces. So teaching outside of those spaces, teaching in a place and in a way that focuses on inclusivity can be a really powerful change. And I think what I hope to see is that all of that comes back together in a way to affect the culture. And I think we're starting to see that with social media, because ultimately the only way we're going to make yoga more accessible overall is by making the imagery and symbolism of yoga that we learn through culture more accessible and more diverse. And Instagram is a great way to do that, but we also need to see industry change as well. We need to see more diverse yogis being represented overall in yoga magazines, Yoga Journal, and also others, Mantra and all these other ones as well, and in general in ads and all these sorts of things. And it's funny too, because a lot of the comeback from the industry is like, oh, it doesn't make us money, right? We can't sell things if we don't put thin white people in it. And it's so silly, because there was this recent company that just opened, I'm forgetting the name of it, but they're challenging, I think, PacSun and they're like a swimsuit, and they're Victoria's Secret. They're a swimsuit company, and what they're doing is they're putting real people in their ads.
Is it swimsuits for all, I think?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
But they've been like, their sales have been freaking skyrocketing.
Of course.
Because everyone's like, oh my God, it's a swimsuit for me.
Yes.
Like, I'm a real person, and they're a real person, and awesome. It looks really great.
And I have her body type, so that one will look good on me, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so their sales have been doing so good. So this idea that it doesn't sell is a complete myth. And I think, we have to start allowing or making the industry realize that we want diversity, we want inclusivity, we want more accurate representations of people in media. And I think once we start seeing that, we're going to start seeing some really cool change. And I think yoga, again, is one of those things, because it's so popular. If we can affect the yoga world and change the way people are presented in yoga, we can affect a lot more than just yoga, because yoga, again, is becoming so popular. It's in everything now, mainstream media, movies, you name it, TV, it's in everything. And so if we can have more diverse representation in yoga, which I think we can get there, because yoga is so intimately connected with social justice, ideally, in the nature of the practice, then, the effect that we can have on mainstream media as a whole, I think, is really powerful. And I hope.
And it's true, we're seeing it. I'm very thankful for Instagram, because I never would have seen people like Jessamine Stanley or or there's ambivalent mind yogi, there's Amber Carnes.
I just shared about big gal yoga.
Big gal yoga. Afro yoga. There's a whole bunch of people out there. I would have never ever seen that. And it's just, now that when I stand in line at the grocery store and I look over at the magazines, I'm now looking to see how many white faces I'm seeing as opposed to how many black faces I'm seeing. And just really recently, a friend of mine, Chelsea Jackson, was on the front of Yoga Journal, and I had spoken to her 3 years ago for a Trailblazer series, and she had gotten together a group of girls from the inner city, and she was using yoga and literacy together as part of her PhD work. And they had to put together a collage, based on their yoga practice, based on how they felt. And she brought all these magazines in, and there wasn't a single person of color in those magazines. And that was a very big topic of conversation. How can I see myself within the yoga culture if I don't see myself within the yoga culture?
You can't be what you can't see.
Exactly. And I'm just hoping, as we begin to evolve, that these publications that occasionally put people of color, they have yet to put a person of any real size on the front of the magazine. Not that I'm not saying that other people don't have real size, but I'm meaning is a bigger size, right, on the front of the magazine. I'm hoping that they're not have their checklist. They're like, oh, look, we put a black person on. Check. We can go back to this. Oh, look, we put a bad picture of Catherine Budick that made her look kind of chubby. Chuck, you know what I mean? Like, I hope that a checklist isn't happening, that real change is affected. And when Dana Smith and I were on the panel, the leadership panel at the Yoga Journal conference last year, our stories, each of us got to write a blog. Everybody on the panel got to write a blog that was featured every day or every week in Yoga Journal online. And Dana and I, the only two people of color on the panel, our blogs were the most popular, got the most hits, were the most shared. So I said to the editor at that time, the proof is in the pudding. These are quantitative things that you can measure and see. So if you can see that the magazine spikes because they see other people on there, and heck, put somebody older on there as well. I mean, really,
that would be awesome.
That would be awesome. Like, really, I don't think these are too much to ask, because these are the people who are actually in yoga class, right?
And so many of these people are incredibly talented
Absolutely.
yogis. Not only in their own practice, but as teachers and as role models, they're doing amazing work. I mean, it's mind blowing to me that we put more emphasis on asana prowess than actual yogic, knowledge and practice. Sometimes, not always. I mean, a lot of people who are really great at asana, of course, are really great yogis too. But so some diversity is what we're looking for. It's not like don't ever show white people.
Just show everybody.
Show a diverse group. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Show everyone.
Show everybody
in a way that allows everyone to be represented. Totally.
Absolutely. I just appreciate that. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, and I could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, but we're coming up on the hour mark of our conversation. I want to thank Amara Miller for weighing in on yoga, social justice, diversity, race, capitalism, feminism, all of it in the context of yoga. It's a really great saying that one of my yoga teachers said to me, that the yoga mat is a mirror for the world. So what we can see and change on the mat, we ultimately can see and change in the world. And I think our conversation today has proved that it's possible that we can be the elements of change. So is there anything else you want to share with us before I let you go? I know your puppy's there beside you and needs your
I know.
attention.
She's starting to bug me. She just woke up. Just keep doing the work you're doing. I can't wait to see what Yoga and Body Image Coalition does next. And
Thanks.
again, I love seeing more yogis get involved in social justice work. So I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I think if we all work together, we're going to make some really profound change.
Absolutely.
Really positive.
Absolutely. So the key here is together we rise. So we have to keep lifting each other up. And I'm looking forward to all your upcoming blogs and some of the stuff that you're writing. I can't wait to get my hands on your dissertation when it's actually done and published and I can find it online, or I can run to Berkeley and look it up, because I will do that. But I'm very excited about the work you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing, and we'll do this together and we can make change.
Thank you so much, Diane. It was so great talking with you.
Great talking to you. Thank you so much.